In the summer of 1995, Amish sisters Iva and Elizabeth Vault harnessed their horse to the family's delivery wagon and vanished from their secluded California valley. For 9 years, the prevailing belief was that they had run away, enticed by the forbidden freedoms of the outside world. But in 2004, a discovery by state environmental workers inspecting abandoned mine shafts silenced the whispers forever. Deep inside the earth, far below the surface, they found the sisters' delivery wagon. The discovery was proof of a violent end, not a quiet escape, shattering the runaway theory. But finding the wagon only deepened the mystery, leaving a far more chilling question. If this is where their journey ended, where were the girls? Quilla was halfway through the painstaking process of oiling the leather harnesses when the quiet rhythm of her day was fractured. The smell of neat's foot oil and old leather filled the barn, a scent that always brought her daughters to mind. Iva and Elizabeth had always handled the tack, their laughter echoing against the rafters, their hands quick and sure. It had been 9 years since those echoes faded. 9 years since the girls, 19 and 23, had hitched the horse to the delivery wagon and simply vanished into the California summer. Methodical and practiced, Quilla worked the oil into a dry martingale. The routine was a comfort, a way to keep the stillness at bay. The Vault farm, nestled in a secluded valley far from the coastal bustle, adhered to the old ways. Life was governed by the sun, the seasons, and the ordnung. But the disappearance had introduced a discordant note that never resolved. The interruption came not as a sound, but as a vibration in the earth, a low rumble distinct from the clip-clop of a buggy or the groan of farm equipment. Quilla paused, rag in hand. Stepping to the barn door, she looked out across the dusty yard. A county sheriff's vehicle, stark white and jarringly modern, was crawling up the long dirt lane. It was an alien presence here. The English authorities rarely came onto the settlement lands unless summoned, and they hadn't been summoned today. A knot of apprehension tightened in her stomach. Wiping her oily hands on her apron, leaving dark streaks on the faded blue fabric, she stepped out into the sunlight to meet the car. A man climbed out, tall and lanky, dressed in a rumpled suit that spoke of long hours. He removed his sunglasses, squinting against the glare. "Mrs. Vault, Quilla Vout?" She nodded, her throat tight. "I am she. I'm Detective Vance Russo. I'm with the Major Crimes Unit." He paused, his expression carefully neutral, professional, yet softened by a look of reluctance. "We need to talk about your daughters, Iva and Elizabeth." The names hung in the air, heavy and sharp. "Have you found them?" The question was automatic, a reflex honed over nearly a decade. Russo looked away for a moment toward the foothills that rose sharply in the distance. "Not exactly, ma'am, but we found something. Something significant." He explained that state environmental workers had been conducting mandated inspections of abandoned mine shafts in the remote foothills. A recent scandal involving a leaking chemical cache in an old mine further north had forced a statewide survey of these historical sites. They were looking for contaminants, rusted equipment, anything that might pose an ecological threat. Deep in a narrow shaft designated only as Site 44B, the survey crew had found something wedged tight far below the surface. "It wasn't mining equipment. It's a buggy, Mrs. Vault," Russo said quietly. "A horse-drawn wagon. The description we have on file from 1995. It seems to match." The world seemed to tilt. A buggy. The delivery wagon, the last tangible piece of their lives before the silence. For years, a faction within the community had whispered that the girls had simply run away, that the allure of the English world, the bright lights and forbidden freedoms had seduced them. Quilla had never believed it. Iva and Elizabeth, with their bright blue eyes and steadfast faith, would never have left without a word. But the absence of evidence had allowed the narrative to fester. "I must see it," Quilla said, the words surprising her with their firmness. "It's a difficult location, Mrs. Vault," Russo said, "rough terrain, and the extraction is still in progress." "I must see it," she repeated, her gaze unwavering. "If it is theirs, I will know it." The elders would disapprove. Involvement with the outside world, immersion in the violence of the past, it was contrary to the principles of acceptance and forgiveness. But this was not about the community. It was about her children. Untying her apron, she let it fall to the dirt. "Take me there now." The drive was long and jarring. The smooth asphalt of the county road soon gave way to winding gravel tracks and finally to rutted dirt paths that seemed barely passable. The air conditioning in the cruiser was a strange, cold sensation against Quilla's skin. They traveled far from the familiar, ordered farmland, climbing steadily into the rugged, isolated mining territory. This was a landscape of scrub oak, dry creek beds, and forgotten history, a desolate place where secrets could be kept indefinitely. Russo was quiet, respectful of her silence. With her hands clasped tightly in her lap, Quilla watched the landscape change. The closer they got, the more the dread solidified into something cold and heavy in her chest. They arrived at the site, a hive of activity that contrasted sharply with the surrounding wilderness. Several official vehicles were parked haphazardly. A large motorized rigging system had been erected over a gaping hole in the earth. Men in hard hats and reflective vests moved with purpose. Russo guided her through the organized chaos toward the edge of the shaft. The opening was wider than she had imagined, perhaps 15 feet across, the edges crumbling and unstable. Be careful, man. Stay behind the tape. Ignoring him, Quilla moved right up to the boundary and looked down. The shaft was deep, a cylindrical maw descending into darkness. The sunlight penetrated only the upper portion, illuminating the rough, uneven walls of rock and earth. And then she saw it. It was rising slowly, jerkily, suspended by thick white ropes attached to its undercarriage. The sight was so grotesque, so profoundly wrong that Quilla felt the breath leave her body. The buggy was unrecognizable at first glance. Skeletal and fragile, it was caked in thick layers of dried mud and grime that obscured its original black color. It looked less like a vehicle, and more like the carcass of some strange beast dredged from a primordial swamp. The wooden wheels were weathered and damaged, spokes broken or missing. The black vinyl of the seat was torn and shredded. The backrest tilted at an unnatural angle. It hung suspended in the center of the shaft, rotating slowly in the abyss. The rope strained under the weight, the winch motor whining in protest. It was a moment that shattered the fragile hope constructed over 9 years. The whispers, the theories, the agonizing possibility that perhaps somewhere they were alive, it all collapsed. This was not the aftermath of an escape. This was violence. This was disposal. The buggy cleared the lip of the shaft. The rigging swung it over solid ground. The smell that rose from it was overwhelming. Damp earth, decay, and the cold scent of the subterranean world. It settled onto the ground with a sickening crunch of weathered wood. The forensic team immediately moved in, cameras flashing, but Quilla was already moving toward the wreckage, driven by a visceral need to touch it, to confirm the horrifying reality that stood before her. Detective Russo moved quickly to intercept her. "Mrs. Vault, please. This is an active crime scene. You can't touch anything." "It is my property," Quilla stated, her voice flat but unyielding. Pushing past him, her eyes scanned the mud-caked wreckage. The forensic technicians exchanged uneasy glances but stepped back, deferring to the detective. Circling the buggy slowly, Quilla absorbed the decay. 9 years of exposure and the weight of the earth had warped and distorted it, yet the fundamental shape remained. Looking at the seating area, she imagined Iva and Elizabeth perched there, their blue and purple dresses vibrant against the black vinyl, their white bonnets crisp in the sunlight. The image was superimposed over the wreckage, a ghostly presence. Certainty was needed. The standard design of the buggies made them nearly indistinguishable to outsiders, but each one bore the unique marks of its owner, the small repairs and modifications made over years of use. Ignoring the damp earth soaking into her dress, she knelt down to peer at the undercarriage, the complex network of springs and braces. The mud was thickest here, hardened like concrete. "I need this cleaned," she said, pointing to the rear axle brace. "Ma'am, we have to process the scene exactly as it is," one of the technicians protested gently. "Russo," Quilla said, not looking up. "Clean it." Russo nodded at the technician. "Do it carefully. Document everything first." The technician used a fine brush and a spray bottle of water to slowly loosen the hardened mud. The process was agonizingly slow. Quilla remained kneeling, motionless, her gaze fixed on the emerging metal. And then she saw it. It wasn't a manufacturer's mark. It was a weld, a rough, uneven seam of metal where the brace had fractured and been repaired. There, Quilla reached out, her finger hovering just above the weld. "My husband Ephraim, he did this the summer before. The brace broke when he hit a washout on the lower road. He was not skilled with the welding torch the English use, but he borrowed one. He was proud of the repair, though it was ugly. It was a detail so specific, so intimate, that it could not be mistaken. A detail that had never been included in the original police report, because who would have thought to mention an ugly weld?" Russo knelt beside her, examining the mark. He looked at Quilla, his expression grim. "You're sure? It is theirs." The confirmation brought no relief, only a profound, crushing weight. The buggy in the mineshaft was a tombstone, even if it held no bodies. Russo stood, wiping his hands on his trousers. He turned to his team. "All right, we have a positive ID. This is officially the Vault cold case. Process everything. I want soil samples from the interior, paint analysis, trace evidence. Tear this thing apart." He spoke quietly with Quilla as the team resumed their work. The initial search of the mineshaft, conducted by the specialized team before the buggy was fully extracted, had yielded nothing else. No human remains, no clothing, no personal items. The buggy was the only thing in the shaft. The agonizing question remained sharper now than ever. If the buggy was here, where were Iva and Elizabeth? The absence of remains felt like a cruel joke, a denial of closure. The drive back to the settlement was heavier than the journey out. The reality of the discovery settled over Quilla like a shroud. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the valley as they approached the Vault farm. News of the discovery had spread quickly, likely relayed by Russo to the local sheriff, who maintained contact with the community leaders. The quiet lanes of the settlement were unusually active. People stopped their work to watch the cruiser pass, their expressions a mixture of shock, grief, and apprehension. Upon returning home, the dormant sorrow of the past 9 years was violently awakened. The farm felt emptier than before. Ephraim had passed away 3 years prior, his heart broken by the uncertainty. Quilla was alone with the truth. That evening, the elders came to her home. Bishop Yoder and 2 deacons sat stiffly in her living room, the room furnished with simple, handcrafted wooden furniture. The air was thick with unspoken tension. "Sister Quilla," Bishop Yoder began, his voice grave, "this news, it has troubled the community deeply." "It is the truth," Quilla replied, her hands folded in her lap. "It is a truth that brings pain and disruption," the bishop countered. "For 9 years, we have prayed for acceptance. We have sought peace in the will of God. This involvement with the English authorities, this reopening of old wounds, it serves no purpose." Quilla looked at him, a spark of defiance igniting in her eyes. "My daughters were taken. Their wagon was thrown into the earth like refuse. This is not God's will. This is the work of man. Evil work. And what will you do, sister?" one of the deacons asked, leaning forward. "Will you immerse yourself in the darkness? Will you seek vengeance? That is not our way." "I seek answers," Quilla said, her voice rising. "I seek to know what happened to my children, and I will not stop until I know." The bishop sighed, a sound heavy with disapproval. "We urge you to reconsider. Accept the mystery. Find solace in prayer. Further involvement with the outside world will only bring more sorrow. It will distance you from your faith, from your people." The meeting ended with a strained prayer, the words feeling hollow in the face of Quilla's resolve. The conflict was clear. A chasm had opened between her commitment to the traditions of her faith and the desperate, primal need of a mother seeking justice. Isolation defined her now, not just by grief but by determination. The community sought to absorb the shock, to smooth over the disruption, and return to the familiar rhythms of th. He halted, swearing loudly, then retreated to his car. Zilla heard the engine start, tires spinning on the gravel as he sped off, leaving her alone in the suffocating darkness of the cornfield. She stayed hidden for a long time, crouched low, her body shaking uncontrollably. The night's silence amplified her pounding heart. When she finally emerged from the field, she ran the rest of the way home. The familiar path had become a landscape of terror. She arrived home hysterical, her clothes torn, her arms covered in scratches. Terrified by her appearance and frantic story, her parents immediately sent for Quilla. Quilla arrived in minutes. The Hostetler farmhouse was in chaos. Zilla was sobbing, her words a torrent of fear and confusion. Kneeling beside her, Quilla felt her own heart pound with dread. She gently took Zilla's hands, her calm presence helping to quiet the rising panic in the room. The community was frozen. The discovery of the buggy, and this new attack suggested something far more sinister than a random act of violence. The threat was not a relic of the past. It was immediate, active, and targeted. The fear that had been simmering beneath the surface erupted into a wave of terror that engulfed the settlement. The sanctuary they had built was no longer safe. The attack on Zilla Hostetler shattered any remaining illusion of safety. The next morning, Detective Russo arrived. The atmosphere was far more charged than his previous visits. The elders, who had previously urged caution, now demanded answers and protection. Quilla found herself in a crucial, though uncomfortable, position. Zilla, traumatized and distrustful of outsiders, refused to speak directly to Russo. She clung to Quilla, the shared trauma creating a strong bond. This made Quilla the intermediary, the bridge between the terrified young woman and the determined detective. They sat in the Hostetler's kitchen, morning light streaming through the windows, illuminating the room's stark simplicity. Quilla gently coaxed the details of the attack from Zilla, translating her fragmented sentences and emotional responses into a coherent narrative for Russo. The assailant's description was vague. He was English, not Amish, heavy-set, with rough hands. His face was obscured by darkness and the chaotic struggle. But the most distinct details were not visual but sensory. "The smell," Zilla whispered, her voice trembling. It was strong like the mash left over from brewing. Sour, yeasty. Quilla felt a chill despite the warmth of the fireplace. The smell of yeast and stale beer was a distinct detail, unusual in their community where alcohol consumption was strictly regulated. "What did he say to you, Zilla?" Quilla asked, squeezing her hand. Zilla recounted the words, phrases laced with bitterness and resentment. "He called me a fraud. He said we thought we were better safe." She looked at Quilla, her eyes pleading for understanding. "He hated us. He hated who we are." This suggested a familiarity with the Amish lifestyle, a deep-seated animosity that went beyond a random act of violence. It wasn't just an attack, it was a targeted assault on their identity. Russo noted everything, his expression unreadable. He assured the Hostetlers that patrols would be increased, but the settlement's isolation made constant surveillance impossible. The interview concluded, and Russo left, promising to return the next day. The community was left to grapple with the reality that they were being hunted. Walking home late that evening, Quilla found the darkness oppressive, menacing. The familiar path seemed fraught with danger. Every shadow, every rustle of the wind sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. She reached her own farm, the house dark and silent. As she approached the front gate post, something caught her eye that hadn't been there when she left. It was a splash of white against the dark wood, an envelope nailed aggressively to the post with a large, rusted nail. Quilla's heart pounded. She scanned the darkness, half expecting the attacker to emerge from the shadows. The yard was empty. Approaching the gate post cautiously, she saw the envelope was plain, unmarked. Fear urged her to leave it untouched, to call the authorities. But the need to know was stronger. Carefully, she pulled the envelope from the nail, the paper tearing slightly. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in crude, handwritten block letters. The handwriting was erratic, aggressive. The message was short, but its impact was devastating. "Stop searching. They are dead anyway. Leave the past buried, or more will follow." Quilla stared at the words, the breath leaving her body. It was a direct threat, a confirmation that the attack on Zilla was connected to the discovery of the buggy. The perpetrator knew who she was. He was watching her, reacting to her involvement. A chilling certainty settled over her. The man who attacked Zilla was the same man who took her daughters. The evil had a shape now, a voice, a smell. She took the letter to Russo the next morning. He examined it carefully, his expression darkening. "He's escalating," Russo said. The discovery of the buggy spooked him. "He's trying to regain control." "He says they are dead," Quilla whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "It might be an intimidation tactic," Russo cautioned. "A way to make you stop looking. We can't assume it's true." The letter was taken for analysis, fingerprints, DNA, paper analysis. But Quilla knew they would find nothing. The perpetrator had been careful, hiding his tracks for 9 years. The threat galvanized Quilla. The fear was still there, a constant companion, but it was overshadowed by a cold, hard anger. This man could not be allowed to terrorize her community. He could not dictate the fate of her daughters. The police investigation was moving too slowly, constrained by procedures and a lack of concrete evidence. Quilla realized passivity was no longer an option. She had to find answers herself. She had to understand what happened 9 years ago. And she had to start at the beginning. The threat letter changed everything. It transformed abstract fear into a tangible danger. But it also ignited a proactive drive in Quilla. Waiting for the police to find a needle in a haystack was unacceptable. If the attacker was watching her, motivated by her search, then she needed to understand the terrain he operated on, both literally and figuratively. Early the next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Quilla entered the barn. The scent of hay and leather was familiar, comforting. She hitched her horse, a sturdy Morgan named Bess, to her own buggy. It was smaller than the delivery wagon, lighter, but the rhythmic movements of preparing the tack were the same. Her intention was to retrace the exact delivery route Iva and Elizabeth had taken on that fateful day in July 1995. It was a route she hadn't traveled in its entirety since the disappearance. The memory was too painful, the associations too raw. But now it was necessary. Packing a small lunch and a jug of water, she left a note for the neighbors who were helping with the farm chores, simply stating she would be gone for the day. No one was told where she was going. The elders would disapprove, and the fear in the community was so palpable that any unusual activity would draw unwanted attention. This was a task she had to undertake alone. The buggy wheels crunched on the gravel lane as she left the farm. The morning air was cool, the valley still shrouded in mist. Quilla guided Bess onto the main settlement road. The clip-clop of the horses' hooves was the only sound in the stillness. The delivery route was extensive, winding through the settlement and extending to neighboring English farms and small towns that relied on the Amish for produce and handcrafted goods. Iva and Elizabeth had been making these deliveries for years. They were experienced, capable. The route was safe, or so they had believed. Methodically, Quilla followed the route, visualizing her daughters on the road ahead of her. The first stop was the Miller farm a few miles down the road. Stopping the buggy at the gate, she looked at the familiar farmhouse. The Millers were still there, older now, their children grown. She didn't go in, just sat there, trying to see what her daughters had seen, to feel what they had felt. She continued on, the sun climbing higher in the sky. The landscape shifted from the ordered fields of the settlement to the more rugged terrain of the surrounding area. The edge of the settlement was reached, the boundary marked by a simple wooden sign. The next stops were the English farms. She visited the locations, some still active, others abandoned. She spoke to the people who were there, the last confirmed sightings of Iva and Elizabeth. She stopped at the Henderson farm, a large ranch that bordered the foothills. Mrs. Henderson, a kind woman who had always been fond of the Vout sisters, met her on the porch. "Quilla, what are you doing out here?" Mrs. Henderson asked, her expression concerned. The news of the recent attack had spread beyond the settlement. "I am retracing their steps," Quilla said simply. "I need to know if there was anything missed, anything unusual that day." Mrs. Henderson sighed, the memory clouding her eyes. "I've told the police everything I know, Quilla. They stopped here around noon. They seemed happy, cheerful. They were talking about the upcoming barn raising. They left heading toward the general store in town." "Did you see anyone else on the road?" Quilla pressed. "Any unfamiliar vehicles? Strangers?" Mrs. Henderson shook her head. "It was quiet, just a normal summer day. I watched them go. They waved." She paused, the memory painful. "It was the last time I saw them." Quilla thanked her and continued on. The route led toward the small town of Oak Haven, a few miles away. The general store was still there under new ownership. The previous owner, Mr. Gable, had retired and moved away. The new owner knew nothing about the disappearance. The trail went cold after the general store. Iva and Elizabeth had presumably started the return journey toward the settlement, taking the back road that skirted the edge of the foothills. This was the stretch of road where the abduction likely occurred. Quilla guided Bess onto the back road. It was isolated, narrow, bordered by dense woods on one side and the rising slopes of the foothills on the other. This was the territory that led toward the old mining country, the area where the buggy was found. She scrutinized the route, her eyes scanning the landscape for anything unusual, anything that might explain how a horse and buggy and two young women could disappear without a trace in the middle of the afternoon. The road was deserted. The silence was heavy. Stopping the buggy several times, Quilla got out to examine the surroundings. She looked for signs of a struggle, remnants of the past. But 9 years of weather and neglect had erased any evidence. It was late afternoon when she noticed it, a break in the dense foliage on the side of the road bordering the foothills. It was subtle, easily missed if you weren't looking for it. Stopping the buggy, she got out and pushed through the overgrown brush, the branches scratching her arms. Behind the screen of foliage was a barely visible track, an old service road likely used for logging or mining access decades ago. It was overgrown, rutted, but still passable for a vehicle with high clearance. Quilla followed the track for a short distance. It led directly into the foothills toward the mining territory. This was a potential abduction point. It offered isolation, a place where an attacker could lie in wait, hidden from the main road. And it provided a direct route to the mines, a way to transport the victims and the buggy away from populated areas without being seen. It was the first tangible piece of the puzzle that fit. It explained the logistics of the disappearance, the absence of witnesses. Returning to the buggy, Quilla's mind raced. The discovery of the service road didn't tell her who the attacker was, but it told her how he operated. He was organized, calculated. He knew the terrain. He had planned the abduction. And if he knew the terrain that well, he was likely local. Someone who knew the back roads, the abandoned mines, someone who blended in, yet harbored a deep-seated hatred for the Amish. The clues were starting to align. The smell of yeast, the anti-Amish sentiment, the knowledge of the local geography. Quilla realized she needed to look closer at the outsiders who interacted with the community, the people who lived on the fringes, both geographically and culturally. Quilla's discovery of the overgrown service road solidified her hypothesis. The perpetrator was someone familiar with the remote geography of the foothills. Coupled with Zilla Hostetler's testimony, the pungent smell of yeast and the venomous anti-Amish rhetoric, a specific profile began to emerge. This wasn't a random stranger passing through. This was someone rooted in the area, perhaps an ex-Amish person, and likely involved in an industry related to brewing or fermentation. The realization forced Quilla to confront a difficult path. The answers were not within the safe confines of the settlement. They were outside, in the English world she had always kept at arm's length. The next day, the journey to Oak Haven, the nearest non-Amish town, began. Guiding her buggy onto the asphalt streets, Quilla felt conspicuous and vulnerable. The noise was jarring, the rumble of engines, the blare of horns, the loud conversations of people rushing past. The modern world felt chaotic, aggressive. She kept her gaze lowered, her hands tight on the reins. Tying Bess to a hitching post near the center of town, a relic of the past that seemed out of place amid the modern storefronts, she noted the curious glances her Amish attire drew. She ignored them, focusing on her purpose. Her first stop was the general store, the same one Iva and Elizabeth had visited the day they vanished. Although the ownership had changed, it remained a central hub for the local community, a place where gossip and information were exchanged freely. Entering the store, the bell above the door jingled cheerfully. The air was thick with the smell of coffee and spices. She approached the counter, waiting patiently as the clerk, a young woman with bright pink hair, finished ringing up a customer. "Can I help you?" the clerk asked, her tone friendly but distracted. "I am looking for information," Quilla began, her voice quiet but firm. "About people who lived in this area around 1995. The clerk looked skeptical. "That's a long time ago. We have records. I am interested in anyone known to be hostile toward the Amish community," Quilla continued, pressing on. "Or anyone who might have been ex-Amish." The clerk's expression shifted. The mention of the Amish community in light of the recent news caught her attention. "You're Mrs. Vout, aren't you?" Quilla nodded. "I'm sorry about your daughters and about what happened to Zilla Hostetler. It's terrible." She paused, thoughtful. "Hostile toward the Amish? That's specific.
Okay.
I don't know anyone like that now, but maybe some of the old-timers." She directed Quilla to the feed market on the edge of town, a place frequented by the local farmers and ranchers who had been in the area for decades. Quilla traveled to the feed market, a large, dusty warehouse filled with sacks of grain and farming equipment. The smell of hay and molasses was familiar, comforting. She found the owner, an elderly man named Mr. Abernathy, in the back office. He was gruff, suspicious of outsiders, but Quilla's directness and her connection to the recent events persuaded him to talk. "Ex-Amish." Mr. Abernathy scratched his chin, leaning back in his chair. "Not many of those around here. The settlement keeps to themselves, but hostile? Yeah, there was one guy. He used to come in here regularly back in the mid-90s. Volatile fellow, always complaining. Had a chip on his shoulder the size of a redwood." "What was he complaining about?" Quilla asked, her heart pounding. "The Amish," Mr. Abernathy said emphatically. "Hated them. Said they were hypocrites, frauds. Said he had left a community in another state. Good riddance, I say. He was a nasty piece of work." A surge of adrenaline rushed through Quilla. This matched the profile. What did he do for a living? "He was trying to start a brewery," Mr. Abernathy said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "A small operation out in the industrial area near the foothills. Thought he was going to make a fortune. Failed miserably. Went bankrupt a year or two later. A brewery, the smell of yeast, the proximity to the foothills. The timeline matched. Do you remember his name?" Quilla asked, her voice tight with anticipation. Mr. Abernathy shook his head. "It was a long time ago. Started with a B, maybe. Baxter, Burr, something like that. I don't remember, but I remember the smell." "The smell?" "Yeah. He always smelled strongly of yeast, like he bathed in the stuff. Unpleasant. A chill ran through Quilla despite the dusty heat of the warehouse. The clues were converging. A bitter ex-Amish man running a failed brewery near the foothills who smelled strongly of yeast. It was too specific to be a coincidence. Thanking Mr. Abernathy, she returned to her buggy. The name was still missing, but she had a concrete lead, a direction to focus her search. Identifying the failed brewery was the next step. And to do that, she needed access to public records. The realization brought a new wave of apprehension. The county records office was in the county seat, a larger town further away, even more chaotic and unfamiliar than Oak Haven.ir lives. But for Quilla, that was impossible. The discovery of the buggy was not an ending. It was a beginning. The silence had been broken, and the echoes from the shaft demanded a response. A few days passed in a strange, suspended state. The discovery of the buggy had indeed brought the unwanted attention the elders feared. Local non-Amish news outlets picked up the story, the sensational angle of the Amish sisters, and the abandoned Mineshaft proving irresistible. Reporters began to lurk on the edges of the settlement, their cameras and microphones intrusive and disrespectful. Disrupted by the constant presence of outsiders, the quiet rhythm of the community frayed, the tension palpable in the air. Quilla tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, tending to the farm, preparing meals she'd barely touched, and praying for guidance. But the image of the wrecked buggy haunted her waking moments and invaded her dreams. Anxiously, she waited for updates from Detective Russo, but the investigation moved with agonizing slowness. The forensic analysis of the buggy yielded little new information. The years of mud and decay had erased most traces of evidence. The community remained divided. Some offered quiet support, bringing food and condolences, their eyes reflecting their own fear and uncertainty. Others kept their distance, their disapproval evident in their averted gazes and hushed conversations. Increasingly isolated, Quilla felt caught between the world she knew and the dark mystery she was compelled to unravel. Then the fragile peace shattered. It was a Tuesday evening, the air still warm from the day's heat. Zilla Hostetler, a young woman from a neighboring farm, was walking home from a quilting circle. Zilla was 19, the same age Iva had been when she vanished. She was known for her gentle nature and her quick laughter, a bright presence in the community. The path she took was familiar, a narrow dirt road that wound through the dense cornfields separating the farms. The corn was high, creating a tunnel of green that muffled the sounds of the evening. The only light came from the rising moon, casting long, eerie shadows across the road. Zilla was humming softly to herself when the silence was broken by the sound of an engine approaching fast from behind. She moved to the side of the road, assuming it was one of the local farmers returning late. But the vehicle was unfamiliar, a dark, heavy utility vehicle, its headlights blindingly bright. The vehicle pulled up sharply beside her, gravel spitting from beneath the tires. Before Zilla could react, the driver's door flew open, and a man jumped out. He was large, heavy-set, his face obscured by the shadows and the glare of the headlights. He moved with a brutal speed that paralyzed her with fear. Grabbing her arm, his grip like iron, he violently attempted to force her into the vehicle. The attack was sudden and savage. Zilla screamed, the sound swallowed by the dense cornfields. "You think you're so pure?" the man growled, his voice rough and laced with a bitterness that chilled her to the bone. "You're nothing but hypocrites. Get in the truck." The smell hit her then, a strong, pungent odor of yeast and stale beer clinging to his clothes mixed with the sour scent of sweat. Zilla fought back with a desperate, unexpected ferocity. The terror that had paralyzed her transformed into a surge of adrenaline. Twisting in his grasp, she kicked wildly at his legs. Biting down hard on his hand, the taste of blood filled her mouth. The man roared in pain and surprise, momentarily loosening his grip. Zilla wrenched her arm free and scrambled backward, stumbling on the uneven ground. She didn't look back, sprinting into the dense cornfields, the sharp leaves slashing at her face and arms. She ran blindly, fueled by terror, the sound of the man shouting angrily behind her echoing in the night. He pursued her for a few moments, crashing through the cornstalks, but the darkness and the density of the field made the chase difficult. Navigating the bureaucracy of the English world was a daunting prospect, but Quilla knew she had no choice. The path forward led directly into the heart of the system she had always avoided. The lead from the feed market was the most significant breakthrough since the discovery of the buggy. The failed brewery connected the sensory details provided by Zilla with the geographical location of the disappearance and the psychological profile of the perpetrator. Now a name was needed. The journey to the county seat was a trial in itself. The distance was too great for the buggy. Quilla had to hire a driver, a local man who often provided transport for the Amish community when travel to the English world was unavoidable. The experience was deeply uncomfortable. The car's speed, the confinement of the cabin, the noise of the traffic, it all grated on her nerves. They arrived at the county records office, an imposing stone building in the center of the bustling town. Stepping out of the car, Quilla felt small and insignificant amidst the towering buildings and the crush of people. Taking a deep breath, she steeled herself for the task ahead. Inside the office was a maze of corridors and counters. The air was stale, smelling of dust and old paper. The noise was overwhelming. The ringing of phones, the clicking of keyboards, the murmur of conversations. It was a world away from the quiet stillness of the settlement. Waiting patiently, Quilla approached the main counter. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with a weary expression, finally looked up. "Yes, I need to access public records," Quilla said, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "Business licenses, permits. What are you looking for specifically?" the clerk asked, her tone bureaucratic and indifferent. "A brewery, a small operation located in the industrial area near the foothills, active around 1995, failed shortly after." The clerk sighed, typing something into her computer. "That's very specific. We have digitized records back to 2000. Anything earlier is in the archives. You'll need to fill out a request form." She handed Quilla a stack of forms, the print small and dense. Quilla stared at the forms, the unfamiliar terminology confusing and intimidating. This kind of bureaucracy was entirely foreign to her. Finding a quiet corner, she began to fill out the forms, her handwriting neat and precise. It took time. The process was slow and frustrating. She had to ask the clerk for clarification several times, each interaction reinforcing her sense of alienation. Finally, the forms were submitted. The clerk told her it would take some time to retrieve the records from the archives. Quilla waited, sitting on a hard wooden bench, her hands folded in her lap. The hours ticked by. The office bustled around her, but she remained still, a silent observer of a world she didn't belong to. Late in the afternoon, the clerk returned with a stack of dusty folders. "These are the records for breweries active in the county between 1994 and 1996. You can look through them at the table over there." Quilla took the folders, the paper brittle and yellowed with age. Sitting at the table, she began to sift through the records. Most of them were for larger operations located in different parts of the county. Her focus remained on the permits for the industrial area near the foothills. She found it in the third folder, a business license application filed in 1994 for a small brewery called Bitter Creek Brewing. The location matched the industrial area described by Mr. Abernathy. The records indicated the business went bankrupt in 1996, and the owner's name was listed at the bottom of the application, Kenton BER. The name resonated with a chilling familiarity. BER, the name Mr. Abernathy had suggested. Quilla stared at the name, the letters blurring slightly. Kenton BER, the bitter ex-Amish man, the failed brewer, the man who smelled of yeast. She had a name. The abstract evil now had an identity. Her hand trembling slightly, she carefully copied the information onto a piece of paper. The address of the brewery was listed, as well as BER's home address at the time of the application. She returned the folders to the clerk, thanking her politely. Leaving the records office, the noise and chaos faded behind her as she stepped out into the late afternoon sunlight. The journey back to Oak Haven was a blur. Quilla's mind was racing, the implications of the discovery overwhelming. Confirmation was needed. She needed to be sure. She went directly to the feed market. Mr. Abernathy was closing up for the day. "Mr. Abernathy," Quilla called out, her voice urgent. "The name? Was it Kenton BER?" Mr. Abernathy paused, a sack of grain slung over his shoulder. He looked at her, his expression surprised. "BR? Yeah, that was it. Kenton BER. How did you find that?" "The records," Quilla said. "The brewery Bitter Creek Brewing." "That's the one," Mr. Abernathy confirmed. "Nasty fellow. Haven't seen him in years. Heard he moved north after the bankruptcy." The confirmation hit Quilla with the force of a physical blow. It was him. The connection was undeniable. Returning to the settlement as darkness gathered, she held the name. Now she needed to convince Detective Russo. She needed to make him see the connection, the urgency. The realization that the man who took her daughters was still out there, possibly living just a few hours away, brought a new wave of fear, but also a desperate, agonizing hope. If he was alive, perhaps Iva and Elizabeth were too. Quilla met Detective Russo the next morning at the edge of the settlement, reluctant to bring him onto the settlement lands and further alienate the elders. They stood by the wooden sign marking the boundary, the morning mist swirling around them. She presented her findings, the information meticulously copied from the county records. The name Kenton Ber, the brewery Bitter Creek Brewing, the timeline 1994 to 1996, the confirmation from Mr. Abernathy, the bitter ex-Amish man who smelled of yeast. Russo listened intently, his expression serious as he examined the paper, the details laid out starkly. "This is compelling, Mrs. Vout," he admitted, impressed by her tenacity. "The connection between the brewery, the smell, and the anti-Amish sentiment, it's a strong lead." "He is the man who attacked Zilla," Quilla stated, her voice unwavering. "And he is the man who took my daughters." "We need to verify everything," Russo cautioned, though his tone suggested he believed her. "I'll run a background check on Kenton Ber. See where he is now." He left, taking the information with him. Returning to the farm, Quilla found the waiting agonizing. The hours stretched endlessly. Russo drove back to the station, his mind working through the implications. The Vout case had been cold for 9 years, a frustrating dead end. Now, thanks to the persistence of the victim's mother, they had a suspect, a strong one. He sat at his desk, the organized chaos of the major crimes unit swirling around him, and ran a background check on Kenton Ber. The results came quickly. Ber was still living in California, about 3 hours north in a small town nestled in the Sierra Nevada foothills. His record was peppered with minor offenses, DUIs, disorderly conduct, a few assaults. Nothing that screamed serial killer, but enough to suggest a volatile personality, a man with anger issues and a problem with authority. The profile fit the description of the man who attacked Zilla Hostetler. The aggression, the impulsivity. Russo dug deeper. The background check provided a timeline of Ber's life, his movements across the country. The focus turned to the period before Ber came to California, the time when he left the Amish community. Mr. Abernathy had mentioned Ber left a community in another state. Russo traced Ber's movements back to Pennsylvania, the heart of Amish country. Accessing the national database for unsolved crimes, he searched for incidents involving the Amish community in the area where Ber had lived. He found it almost immediately. A cold case from 1992, the disappearance of a young Amish girl, Sarah Stoltz, aged 16. She had vanished while walking home from school. No witnesses, no evidence left behind. The case had never been solved. Russo felt a chill. The similarities to the Vout case were striking. The victim profile, the circumstances of the disappearance, the lack of evidence. He contacted the Pennsylvania State Police, requesting the case file for the Sarah Stoltz disappearance. The file was faxed over, the pages curled and faded. Sifting through the reports, the interviews, the theories, he saw the name Kenton Ber. Ber had been questioned at the time of the disappearance. He had recently left the Amish community, his departure acrimonious and public. He was known for his hostility toward the community, his open resentment of their lifestyle. But there was no evidence linking him to the disappearance. He had an alibi, albeit a weak one, and was dismissed as a suspect. Russo leaned back in his chair, the realization hitting him with full force. They were not dealing with an isolated incident. They were dealing with a serial offender, a man who had been hunting Amish women for over a decade. The Vout sisters were not his first victims, and the attack on Zilla Hostetler suggested they would not be his last. The urgency of the situation escalated dramatically. Ber was active, dangerous, and likely aware that the investigation was closing in on him. Russo initiated surveillance on Ber's current residence. He needed to know Ber's routine, his movements, his contacts. Evidence linking him directly to the Vout case was required, something concrete enough for a search warrant. The surveillance team was dispatched to Northern California. Russo waited impatiently for the first reports, the tension mounting. The Vout case had become a ticking clock, and he feared they were running out of time. The surveillance operation began immediately. A team of undercover officers established a perimeter around Kenton Ber's residence, a rundown apartment complex on the outskirts of the small Northern California town. The goal was to observe, document, and gather enough evidence to justify a warrant. Russo received the initial reports later that day. Ber was observed behaving erratically. He paced his apartment, peered through the blinds, and made frequent trips to his vehicle, a dark blue Ford Bronco, matching the description of the utility vehicle used in the attack on Zilla. He seemed paranoid, agitated. This was both encouraging and alarming. It suggested BER was feeling the pressure, perhaps aware that the discovery of the buggy had reignited the investigation, but it also increased the risk that he might bolt, destroy evidence, or worse. Russo decided to oversee the surveillance operation personally. Driving north, he arrived late in the evening and met with the surveillance team, reviewing the logs and the photographs. The next day, Russo took up a position in an unmarked car, watching BER's apartment. The hours dragged on. The monotony of surveillance was punctuated by brief bursts of activity. BER emerged mid-morning, looking disheveled and agitated. He got into his Bronco and drove out of the apartment complex. Russo and his team followed, maintaining a discreet distance. BER drove aimlessly for a while, taking back roads, seemingly trying to detect if he was being followed. Finally, he headed toward an isolated industrial area outside of town. Russo recognized the area. It was the site of BER's former brewery, Bitter Creek Brewing. The property was seemingly abandoned, surrounded by overgrown weeds and a rusted chain-link fence. The main building, a large warehouse, looked dilapidated, the windows boarded up, the paint peeling. BER parked his Bronco near the entrance and got out. He looked around nervously before unlocking the gate and entering the property, disappearing inside the warehouse. Russo watched from a distance, a knot of apprehension tightening in his stomach. Why would BER be visiting an abandoned brewery, a place associated with his failure and bankruptcy? BER remained inside the warehouse for several hours. Emerging late in the afternoon, he locked the gate behind him and drove back to his apartment. The pattern repeated the next day and the day after that. BER made repeated, lengthy visits to the abandoned warehouse. He was seen entering a specific section of the building, a large storage area that should have been condemned. Russo felt a growing certainty that the warehouse was significant, isolated, secure, and directly linked to BER's past. It was the perfect place to hide something, or someone. Russo reported back to Quilla, the frustration evident in his voice. He met her at the edge of the settlement, the tension between them palpable. He's spending hours at the old brewery, Russo explained, leaning against his car. The warehouse. We think he's using it for something. Then search it, Quilla urged, her voice tight with impatience. If he is the man who took my daughters, the answers are in there. We can't, Russo said, rubbing his temples. We don't have enough probable cause for a search warrant. The connection to the Vout case is still circumstantial. We have the background match, the suspicious activity, but no direct evidence linking him to the disappearance or the attack on Zilla. The smell, Quilla insisted. The brewery, the ex-Amish background, it all fits. It fits a profile, Russo countered. But it's not enough for a judge. If we go in without a warrant, any evidence we find will be inadmissible. We have to do this by the book. Quilla was distraught at the delay. The legal constraints of the English world felt like a cruel joke. While the police waited for permission, the man who terrorized her community was free and active. The recent attack on Zilla convinced her that BER was escalating. She feared he might disappear, taking the truth with him. And the agonizing possibility remained, faint but persistent, that one of her daughters might still be alive, held captive in that warehouse. The image of the dark, dilapidated building haunted her. The thought of Iva or Elizabeth trapped inside, suffering for 9 years while the world moved on, was unbearable. The police were paralyzed, constrained by rules and procedures. Quilla realized with a chilling clarity that if she wanted answers, she would have to find them herself. The realization was terrifying, but also liberating. Relying on the English authorities was no longer an option. The fight was hers now. The realization that the investigation was stalling, hampered by the very laws meant to protect, crystallized a desperate resolve within Quilla. The police were too constrained, their movements too predictable. If they couldn't act, she would. She had to see Kenton BER for herself, to see the brewery. Proof was needed, something undeniable that would force Russo's hand. The decision was a profound transgression against the norms of her community, against the teachings of her faith. To actively pursue the man who had wronged her, to immerse herself in the darkness of his world, was contrary to the principles of acceptance and non-resistance. But the primal drive of a mother seeking her children overshadowed everything else. The logistics were complex. Traveling to Northern California, a journey of several hours, required secrecy. She approached the driver she had hired before, a man named Elias, known for his discretion. "I need you to take me north," she told him, her voice low and urgent. "A few hours away. I will be gone for a few days." Elias looked at her, his expression troubled. He knew the context, the recent events. Quilla, this is dangerous. The elders. I will not ask you to lie for me, Quilla interrupted. But I must go. Will you take me? Elias hesitated, then nodded slowly. I will take you. Quilla packed a small bag, her movements methodical, detached. She wore her traditional Amish attire, the dark dress, the white bonnet. It would make her conspicuous, but it was also a shield, a reminder of who she was and why she was doing this. A message was left with her neighbors, a half-truth, stating she was traveling to visit distant relatives who needed assistance. It was a plausible excuse, but she knew it wouldn't hold up to scrutiny. The only thing that mattered was finding the truth. The journey north was a blur of asphalt and noise. Quilla sat in the passenger seat, silent, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The landscape shifted, the flat farmland giving way to the rolling hills of the Sierra Nevada foothills. They arrived in the small town late in the afternoon. Elias dropped her off at a modest motel on the edge of town, a place that catered to travelers passing through. The transaction was awkward. The motel clerk stared at her with undisguised curiosity. Settling into the small, sterile room, Quilla noted the unpleasant smell of disinfectant and stale cigarette smoke. The sound of the television from the neighboring room seeped through the thin walls. She felt utterly alone, isolated. She had the address of BER's apartment complex, provided by Russo during their last meeting. It was a few miles away on the other side of town. As evening fell, Quilla left the motel. She walked the distance, the exercise manageable and calming her nerves.